how I came to do a PhD on it is really quite by accident. I had taken Sir James Hēnare to a cup of coffee in Kawakawa, and I was urging him in a polite way that a young person tries to urge a rangatira of his status, that maybe he should put all his things down in writing so that we could all remember that. And so he was to say, I got a better idea. He said, you go do a PhD on Whakaputanga and do the scholarly side of the oral tradition. So he saw himself as an oral tradition person, and he said, we need some scholarship, because he said, there will be a day when Whakaputanga becomes the political issue again. And remember, from the 16th century right up to the 18th, 19th century, Maori society was just blossoming. And it's in this period that Maori carvings, as we know it today, is taking off. Paintings was taking off. So clearly something was happening that enabled this takeoff in art and form and things like this. And of course, usually that's because there's a healthy economy to sustain the activity. And so the high level of art form that we see from the 16th century tells you that there must have been no dynamic economy, because it meant that certain people were now free to concentrate solely on art form. And so England suddenly takes an interest, because here's this garden producing trees, kauri trees. Captain Cook saw trees and he saw ships, and Maori from the Bay of Islands say, yeah, we'll give you spars for your boats, and we'll give you timber for your fleet and for Trafalgar and so forth. And so you had that lovely mix of Maori entrepreneurial chiefs providing products for Great Britain, who became the chosen international market for Maoris. And that's all taking place from the 18th century onwards. So there's an articulation of a grand idea. Te whakaminenga o ngā hapu is the grand idea of the Declaration of Independence, because they knew, on the advice of Busby and others, you can't claim independence unless you have a coherent body that does the claiming. So they got the rangatira together and formed Te Whakaminenga o ngā hapu. Now, there's lots of words for a hui, or meetings in Māori, runanga, hui, all these, but whakaminenga is a high-level kind of meeting, almost at the spiritual level. It refers to the coming together of the divine will with the human will. There is a period before 1840 which explains why 540 Maori leaders in just over 6 months would suddenly sign this treaty with the British, which is a phenomenal achievement. I reckon we would have trouble getting 540 rangatira today to agree on anything. And so how did this happen? And how come from the Bay of Islands to far south as Awarua Bluff, they all had the common mind, from Tuhawaiki to the Hongi Hikas. And that can only be explained because these characters were meeting each other on a regular basis. And the hapu were the dominant political institutions at this time, not the iwi. The iwi would come in the 1850s. So you have this going on. And once they formed Te Whakaminenga, then they said, ko te kingitanga mana i te whenua. And they used the two notions of sovereignty, ko te kingitanga, the sovereignty of the king, because they did know that in England, the sovereign had all the mana. So that's why they insisted on the kingitanga to get that idea. And then they expressed it in a beautiful Māori term. They said, ko mātou mana i te whenua. And what that says is, we can speak because we have the mana that comes from the land to us, not mana o te whenua. They're not saying we have the mana over the land. We have the mana simply because the land is in us. And when we speak, we're saying our country, our whenua rangatira, indeed is free and prosperous, which is the meaning of whenua rangatira, which is in the declaration. So there's some beautiful, beautiful phrases in there. So when you look at all those events together, the 6 as you call them, we refer to them, you'll see a consistent behaviour and a consistent thought pattern. At no stage was a notion of mana or sovereignty ever considered as something to give away. So the idea that the treaty is a treaty of cession of sovereignty just is illogical. Māori is shifting from a oral tradition to now a written oral tradition. All their thinking is now put to paper. And when you think of literacy like that, I mean, a letter, a document is merely a set of ideas frozen in time. That's the beauty of writing. And so suddenly we now know what they thought in 1831. Why? Because they wrote a letter. And it's no longer just oral in people's memory. And so too with the Whakaputanga, the declaration. So they were determined that it should be in writing, not just a public statement. My theory is that James Busby was a Scot first and an English person second, because he was giving them advice as if they were like Scottish peoples. In fact, he referred to the marae as being a meeting where all the clan leaders used to meet. Wherever the clan leaders met, they met on the same patch of land. And that's the similarities he saw between the clan and the tribe. So he advised them accordingly. So when the clan leaders aggregate themselves into bigger interests, they have a parliament. And he referred also to some of the large rangatira meetings as early Māori parliaments. So he advised them on principles to do with international law, from Emmerich de Vattel's Law of Nations. So here the rangatira in the 1830s, 1840s, getting advice on the latest international law. And so when they declared independence, they knew, because they've been informed, that when doing this, no cession is given. And so the Whakaputanga is carefully crafted to make sure that no cession of sovereignty is ceded. And it's based on Emmerich de Vattel's Law of Nations. So when you put all that together, and then suddenly after 1835 they declare independence, and 5 years later they cede sovereignty in perpetuity. The logic of it defies imagination, really. And most of us were born, raised, that we ceded sovereignty, our leaders ceded sovereignty forever. And then I think as the Māori history started coming out, then a lot of us had to change our minds. Even though our instincts said that doesn't make sense, but we had no basis for saying it other than, I can't imagine our tupuna doing it. But so we've been able to now look at it fairly rationally and look at their actions, say from 1831, 1834, 1835, 1840. And then after that, in 1847, 1850s, you find all the Māori leaders the next generations afterwards all singing the same song. We did not cede sovereignty. You took it. And so today, if we're true to the voices of the ancestors, we have no option but to sing the same song. And that's why you get the consistency in expression of understanding of that historical period. And basically it goes this way. All the treaty settlements represent about 1 to 3% of the total of the loss. So some hapu or some tribes might get 20, 30, 70 million. That's still only 1 to 3, maybe 4 or 5% at the most of the actual loss. Well, what I did for kind of whimsical thing, but I looked at Confucian law, I looked at Islamic law, and I looked at English jurisprudence on the notions of fairness. I can tell you this, I couldn't find any moral argument anywhere in the world that 3% of a loss is considered fair and just. Now, so we get ourselves tangled in moral problems, which I think as a nation we're having trouble coping with. And so the sooner we own up to this and then say, now how are we going to deal with reparation? Now, Germany has just, up to a few years ago, just finished paying back the reparations for its invasions of Belgium, Netherlands, and the Second World War. Japan has just finished paying off its reparations for its invasion of some of the Asian countries in the Second World War. And the way they did it was they built into their annual budgets that maybe 3, 4, 5% of the annual budget is reparation. What the New Zealand governments do is they look to see how much cash might be left after they've paid off everything else, and so you come up with these small amounts. But we just don't have a political will, centre left or centre right, to say, well, let's fix this once and for all and get the satisfaction. So when Maori say, yes, we are satisfied that what was taken illegally by land, doesn't matter how it was taken, has been compensated. And therefore it's going to cost billions of dollars. But if you space it out over time, it's painless. So until that is addressed, that question of the reparation to do with the loss of the 60 million acres, until that's addressed in a meaningful way, then I can't see how logically any future Maori community can say we have a full and final settlement. See, time is really on the Maori side. The Maori population is increasing. It's expected by another 20 years the Maori population will be some 25, 30, 40%, plus Pacific Islanders and Asians. Don't forget, Pacific Islanders, as I said earlier, and Asians are not part of the problem. And very soon there is going to be a new majority. And my instincts tell me that is when we'll be able to look at the problem as a moral one and then remedy it politically and economically.